Then There's California, our podcast featuring members of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus in conversation about their legislative priorities, policies, and other related issues that make California exceptional. From the state capitol in Sacramento, I'm Brian Green. The United States in 2019 and going into 2020 is at a very fragile place right now. We are on the threshold of two major national inflection points within the next year, our presidential election and our once-a-decade U.S. Census. Our challenges in both of these constitutional rites of passage are serious and sobering, ensuring that all Americans eligible to vote are thus able and compelled to go to the polls, that the integrity of our elections process is secured, and that each one of us is fairly and legally counted and is backed up by the appropriate representation in Washington that we deserve. In California, we're in about as secure a place as we can be with regard to our election systems and voting process. But we are only one state in a sea of 50, and like many other states, we still are at the mercy of the federal impact on our electoral process and still have to do more to rise to the challenge of confronting voter apathy and disillusionment, and congressional and Supreme Court decisions on the 2020 census will most definitely affect how California residents are counted and whether we have appropriate representation in Congress to make our future votes count and fair access to federal dollars to help our state thrive. On this edition of Then There's California, we'll have a conversation about all of these election and census issues with two state leaders who are making the security and integrity of our right to vote in 2020 a priority sooner than later, and who are fighting for all California voices and individuals to be heard and accounted for and supported by their federal government. Senator Tom Umberg represents Garden Grove in Orange County, the 34th Senate District, and though he is a freshman senator, he is hardly a freshman in government and the legislative process. Senator Umberg served 3 terms in the state assembly in the 1990s, is a former federal prosecutor and deputy drug czar for the Clinton administration, a small business owner, and, prior to all of that, served our country with distinction as a colonel in the U.S. Army, where he was awarded a Bronze Star for meritorious service in a combat zone during 3 overseas military tours. Senator Umberg is currently chair of the Senate Elections Committee and also a co-chair of the Senate Committee on the Census, titles that definitely come in handy for this discussion. And joining Senator Umberg, we are proud to have with us California Secretary of State Alex Padilla. It's always beneficial to have a rocket scientist at the helm of California's elections process, and that is Alex Padilla. Secretary Padilla also served 2 full terms as a state senator from Los Angeles County. He's a former L.A. City Council member who has shown his expertise, as has Senator Umberg, in vital California priorities such as education, science and technology, immigrant rights, and the elections integrity. Senator Umberg, Mr. Secretary, it is a privilege to have you here. Welcome to Then There's California.
Thank you, Brian. Good to see you again.
Thank you, Brian. It's a pleasure to be here with you and Mr. Secretary.
So, Secretary, I called you a rocket scientist in the outset. I didn't really elaborate, but from going to MIT, working at Hughes Aircraft, now you're Secretary of State. Just briefly, tell me about that arc from beginning to where you are now.
Exactly. We got some explaining to do as rocket scientists. So my background, education-wise, is in mechanical engineering. I received my bachelor's in mechanical engineering from the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, 4 years back east, but came quickly back home to Southern California, working briefly in the aerospace industry. So I think that's where the rocket scientist analogy comes from. But making the leap from engineering into politics and public service, the short version I like to joke around with is, well, engineers are trained to solve problems. Isn't that what our elected officials are supposed to be doing, right, Tom? I think
that's what we're about.
The full story is a little bit more complex. Working in Southern California in the early 90s in aerospace was not exactly a good time to be in that industry. It was not startup. There's an app for that world. It was layoffs because of the economy. And so searching for another career path. I was raised with a lot of volunteerism and public service, fortunate to find opportunities in that space at a very difficult time. If you recall, in 1994, that was the year of Proposition 187 on the California ballot. A lot of immigrant scapegoating, a significant anti-Latino political environment, much like what we're seeing and feeling across the country today. That was California just 25 years ago this November. And that's when I realized I needed to get engaged in community organizing, in political involvement, so that my community would not continue to be a target. And that led to some voter registration drives, volunteering on political campaigns. 5 years later, I was running for office, and here I am today.
With your finger on the pulse of California elections.
Right, and trying to make it easier for as many eligible people to participate.
And you, Senator Umberg, you, of course, have had your own unique track record. Colonel in the Army, drug czar, federal prosecutors.
Well, Brian, you're making it seem like I can't hold a job. That's what it sounds like, right?
Well, we're also talking about the fact we have a couple of decades in between there. So, but here you are.
No, that's right. And I actually hadn't started out really being involved in politics. I was a federal prosecutor in Orange County. And what got me involved and keeps me really involved is an event that happened in 1988. On Election Day in 1988, I was the federal prosecutor on duty, and I got a phone call about an election abnormality that in Santa Ana and in Garden Grove, there were police officers purportedly keeping Latinos from voting. And so I called the FBI. And then I got another phone call a little while later about armed police officers that were asking for proof of citizenship before they would allow people to enter the polling place. That sounded strange. I called the FBI again. And then lastly, I got another call, and finally I grabbed another federal prosecutor, and he and I went out to see for ourselves whether this was actually happening. And we went to Santa Ana High, and lo and behold, there was a policewoman, or at least what we thought was a policewoman, holding a sign that said, "Non-citizens may not vote." And we watched as a Latino couple walked up to her. We were about probably 50 meters away and saw what appeared to be a verbal exchange, and they walked away. We got out of the vehicle. Of course, we were not police officers. We were prosecutors and thought we would, interview the woman, and she dropped her sign, and we immediately gave chase and lost after about 100 meters. And that really was a spark that lit the fire in my belly in terms of elections. I just thought it was an outrage. It wasn't illegal at the time, by the way, and had no chance of winning in Orange County as a Democrat at the time. But lo and behold, we won. And here I am, some couple, 3 decades later, as chair of elections, and happy to do so and to sort of keep that in mind, that that's our obligation here, is to make sure, as Secretary of State Padilla pointed out, that those who are eligible to vote, that they have every opportunity to vote, and that we make sure that there are no impediments to them voting.
Tom, that's a powerful, powerful story, and appreciate you sharing that, because I think that's at the root of a lot of why we're doing what we're doing together. Yes, I'm the Secretary of State, but a lot that I cannot do without the support of the legislature and the governor, so we're in this together. But that story about the woman, the sign, and the couple that walked away from a polling place is so antithetical to the democracy that we're told our nation is all about, right? When we all study high school government class. Our democracy works best when as many eligible people participate. So yes, we're in the election security business. Yes, we're in the election integrity business, but we should be equally in the election access business. There's a reason why there's laws both at the state and at the federal level protecting our fundamental voting rights. Every eligible citizen in America should be able to easily register to vote without any undue barriers or obstacles. And every registered voter should be able to cast their ballot without any interference, harassment, or barriers or obstacles. And a lot of what California has put in place in recent years is driven exactly by that. So we've come a long way as a state since 1988, thankfully. Unfortunately, a lot of the rest of the country hasn't. And that's part of, I think, what California is all about. Not just seeing the opportunity, but frankly, the obligation to show the better way for the rest of the nation.
Yeah. And Secretary Padilla is really leading the way in the areas he's talked about, both access as well as encouraging all those who are eligible to vote, and also making it easier for folks to vote either through the mail or by creating vote centers, which are a little different than polling places that are going to happen in the next election. You're going to see many counties are going to have, including Orange County, area I represent, are going to have vote centers. These vote centers are going to be sort of a consolidation of polling places, but it should cost us a lot less to run an election, should provide accessibility. And also, we have a bill that allows folks to engage in same-day voter registration. Now, there are certain safeguards to make sure that people who are registering on Election Day are qualified to do so, either checking against other databases to make sure that they are legally qualified to register to vote, so they can do so at vote centers. And those counties that don't want to have vote centers, that they provide for, in essence, same-day registration at the polling places.
Well, that was part and parcel of what our midterm elections in 2018 were all about. That was our experiment here in California. But let's rewind a little bit back to 2018. How did that experiment work in both of those ways, with the same-day registration and those election centers in some of those lab cities, including Sacramento, that tried that, and also the access to absentee voting that many Californians had not had up until that point?
Well, you may be asking a biased observer because I won.
Yeah, right.
Right.
But also high voter turnout. We had the highest
very
voter
high
turnout.
voter turnout.
So
That's
obviously,
right.
at
That's
least
right.
on paper, at least at first glance, we saw success.
So a couple data points. Number one, in 2014, just 4 years, the prior midterm to 2018, on the November election day, there was about 17.2 million registered voters on the rolls. 4 years later, November 2018, we were just shy of 19.7 million registered voters on the rolls. So an increase of about 2.5 million new voters on the rolls in the state of California. Tremendous increase, in large part because of the policy work that we've done, right? California has gone a long time ago from paper registration to being able to register to vote online or to update your registration online. We allow for 16 and 17-year-olds to pre-register to vote. And of course, the same-day registration that you talked about, Tom, where before this artificial deadline of 2 weeks before the election, you had to be enrolled, otherwise you weren't eligible to cast your ballot on Election Day. But on top of that, I think in the last year, the biggest movement of the needle has been thanks to automatic voter registration. So the way that works is people who are eligible, when they apply for or renew their driver's license or their state ID through the DMV, and it can be in person, it can be online by mail. If you're eligible, you're automatically added to the voter rolls unless you choose to opt out. And in the first year alone, 1 million people have been registered that way. Another great advantage of that is there's been about 3 million people who have updated their information, whether it's address change, political party preference, whatever that is. So we actually have much more cleaner, accurate voter rolls as well because of automatic registration. That's just the registration part. To your point about turnout, 2014, 42.5% turnout rate. The majority of registered voters didn't even turn out to vote. Last November, turnout was 64.5%, which is even more impressive when you factor in that increase in voter registration. So yes, turnout is on the rise. The 5 counties that were the first to adopt the Voters' Choice Act, and we should talk about what that means in a second, all exceeded the record statewide turnout, 64.5%. That was the highest rate for a midterm election since 1982. So something great is happening here in California, and looking forward to 2020, we know there's additional counties that have chosen to move in that direction. About half of the state's electorate will now enjoy the options and the benefits of the Voters' Choice Act.
We still have work to do, though. I know on Election Day, I was out walking door to door, and then nearly at 8 o'clock when the polls closed, I visited several polling places and saw long, long lines. Kudos to the people who stood in that line for over an hour after polling places closed in order to cast their ballot. And at the Registrar of Voters office in Orange County, people were there 3 or 4 hours because they could register if they wanted to, and if they were legally eligible to, they could register, and they were highly motivated, which was inspiring to me to cast their ballot. But it also tells me that we have to do a better job. We shouldn't have to have folks wait for an hour or more after the polling place closed, and we shouldn't have folks waiting at the Registrar of Voters office for many hours. In Los Angeles, even worse than Los Angeles County, you've got to travel to Norwalk, I believe, if you want to cast a ballot on
there was more than a handful of voters that I talked to on Election Day as I was staffing our voter hotline at the Secretary of State. People asking me 5, 6 o'clock, if I haven't registered, but can I still vote? Where do I need to go? And they were willing to sit in that LA traffic to get there before 8 o'clock. Look, I think the long lines we saw in November 2018 tell me a couple of things. Number one, interest in participating is way up. Number two, the lines at county elections offices up and down the state tell us that there's a demand for that same-day registration option, and we have to broaden it beyond just the county elections office. And that's where vote centers come in and other initiatives. And so part of making it easier is building on the success of the Voters' Choice Act. So just to describe what that is briefly, the old way of voting for us has been you can choose to vote by mail. If you want in California, you don't need an excuse. You can request a vote by mail ballot for one election or on a permanent basis. But if you want to vote in person, you're really limited. You have one designated location close to where you live, election day only from 7 a.m. to 8 p.m., and that's it. You know, for most people who work for a living especially, rare is it that you have a 9-to-5 schedule now. You know, everybody deals with traffic or some sort of commute to get home from work. Then you got to get kids from school, get dinner on the table. Now you got to go stand in line. It's not a user-friendly setup that we have when it comes to elections. Enter the Voters' Choice Act. And this is how I believe elections will look for most, if not all, of California in the coming years. Number one, every voter will automatically receive their ballot in the mail a month before the election. You don't need to request it. No, don't need an excuse. Everybody gets a ballot. And every voter has options for how to return that ballot. You can mail it back. And thanks to you, Tom, and the legislature and the governor, return postage is now prepaid. So finding a stamp is not an obstacle. Counties will install what are known as ballot drop boxes, kind of like a mailbox, but marked for ballots only, and any voter can return their ballot to any secure drop box anywhere in the county convenient to them in those weeks leading up to the election. And for folks who want that in-person experience or opportunity or need assistance of some sort, we're modernizing polling places as we know them to what are known as vote centers, where any voter can go to any location in the county convenient to them. You know, voting close to home isn't always the most convenient, and these vote centers are open for up to 11 days, up to and including election days. So for all the people who want early voting, we got it. People who want weekend voting, we got it. You want to vote on election day, that's your option, that's your choice. But frankly, the majority of Californians are voting by mail, right? We're up on about 6 election cycles now where the majority of ballots have been vote by mail ballots.
And that's an excellent point. So that in 2020, many places you should be able to vote on your way to work. So we're from Orange and Los Angeles counties, and people live long distances from where they work. And so if there's a vote center near where you work, you can cast your ballot there on your way to and from up to 11 days before.
So the Orange Crushers stay on the freeways and not at the polling places. Is that what
exactly
you're saying?
Right. That's exactly right. You know, one other thing, Mr. Secretary, we should talk about is that there's this myth, I think, of vote fraud. And in terms of being able to register on the same day, people can't just walk up randomly and sort of register and expect their ballots to be counted if they're not eligible. Because what happens is if you register on Election Day, before your ballot is actually counted, your name is run through a couple of databases, the Social Security database and the DMV database, to make sure that you're a real person and that you're eligible to cast a ballot. And so I hear this sort of myth being promulgated, and it's just simply wrong.
Mr. Secretary, to that point, I'm glad you brought that up, Senator. Back in 2016, President Trump convened this commission to investigate the presidential election after all these unsubstantiated claims that between 3 million and 5 million ballots were illegally cast. Many state election officials, including you, just outright rejected those claims of this widespread voter fraud and refused to hand over all this data that this elections commission wanted. Rewind a couple of years and just talk about the position you were put in that situation to say, just hold on. California's not responsible for this. California doesn't have to deal with this.
Right. Well, I think what triggered the standoff was the Trump administration's unprecedented request for personal information of every voter in America, not just California.
Right.
And what they were asking for was the name of every registered voter in the state, address, date of birth, party affiliation, vote history, military history, criminal history, just on and on, far beyond what people submit on a voter registration card. And it was not lost on me what the true purpose and intent was of Trump and this commission that he had established. Maybe this goes back to the engineering education I have, right? You start with facts. And if the concern is about voter fraud, let's look at facts, because there have been numerous studies, numerous reports, numerous inquiries, etc., and they all show the exact same thing. voter fraud is exceedingly, exceedingly rare. So there's absolutely no truth to his claim of 3-5 million illegal votes in the state of California. But we take the question of voter fraud very seriously. And so we asked the Trump administration for any proof, any information, any evidence they can provide so that we could investigate. And year after year of asking and hearing time and again these baseless accusations, they've come forward with nothing. We take the integrity of our elections seriously, and a lot of what we've done to modernize elections isn't just about increasing accessibility of the elections, but it's also with an eye on improving security. You know, with more and more people voting by mail and facilitating in-person early voting through these vote centers, we can detect any irregularities earlier in the process and not have to wait till election day or maybe 5-6 o'clock on election evening to find out something is just not right here. So it's helpful both from a voting rights and access standpoint as well as a security standpoint to move to these new election models.
Again, to that point and to your story that you opened up with, voter fraud is really not so much the problem in this state and in this country. It's suppression. It's the discouragement of voters at the polls and making it as difficult as possible for them to get to the polls.
I think this whole issue of voter fraud is really a red herring, and it's used as a sort of a straw man to justify voter suppression. Yeah. And as Secretary Padilla points out, there's just no empiric studies that show that that's really a factor. Fortunately, we, with leaders like Secretary Padilla in California, are really leading the way. As you pointed out early on here in this conversation, there are some states that are doing exactly the opposite, making it more and more difficult. And I thought we had sort of resolved those issues in the 60s, but apparently not.
I think everybody would agree we're living in an unprecedented political environment as well. You know, the voter suppression is as un-American as it gets, in my opinion, based on, you know, what we all believe in, the Constitution, our civil rights, our voting rights, etc. And the reason it's also dangerous is not just, you know, how many people does it physically keep from voting across the country, but the mindset too, right? Similar to were the elections hacked or not. If people get it into their mind that maybe their vote won't be counted, or does my vote even matter, and they choose not to vote because of the climate of voter suppression, you know, that's harmful to our democracy and the confidence people deserve to have in our institutions.
Notwithstanding the success of turnout that we had in 2018, and hopefully that's more the rule going forward and not the exception, we rank at the bottom in our country of developed nations in voter turnout, which is pretty sad because in some countries voting at the polls is a life or death exchange. And we always say you can't complain about politics if you don't vote. But there are some people where you could literally put a ballot box in their living room and they wouldn't walk to it. So from your perspectives, why do so many Americans and many Californians refuse to go to the polls? And how do you deal with this in a nonpartisan way to get them to it?
Well, you may be asking the wrong guy. And the reason I say that is because I know how important it is to vote. I know what difference it makes in terms of your education, transportation. If you want to see education change, you should vote. If you're concerned about transportation, you should vote. If you're concerned about health care, you should vote. And to your point about complaining about these things and not voting, well, everyone has a right to complain. But if you want to see change, that's the only way to do it. And I've been privileged, both in my civilian capacity as well as my military capacity, have been in countries where votes have been suppressed, or, for example, in Afghanistan, where people literally risk their lives to vote. And I mean, there are many heroes in places like Afghanistan who have protected folks' right to vote. And so having seen people who have risked and some have even given their lives in order to allow others to exercise their franchise, I don't quite understand it. But even if I don't understand it, it's still our collective obligation to make sure that we do everything we can to demonstrate to people that we have this unique democracy. This really is. The United States is really unique among countries in the world. And the reason that we are unique is because we do have a vibrant democracy. But one way to lose it is where voters become disinterested and an autocrat, for example, becomes extremely powerful. I mean, that's happened historically in other places. And I think our institutions are strong, but they are under siege right now. And so this next election, the 2020 election, I actually think it is the most important election in my lifetime.
Look, I agree. If you go back, 5, 10, 15, 20 years, the lower participation rates have been the trend in California and beyond. But I think 2016 was a pivotal inflection point. And if you look at the 2018 cycle and what we're already seeing going into 2020, it's going to reverse that trend. A lot of people are maybe happy about the outcome of the presidential election in 2016, and that's their motivation for registering or getting ready to vote in 2020. And there's certainly a lot of people who are not happy about the results of 2016. And that's their reason to engage, to register, or to get ready to vote in 2020. But the point is, regardless of your political leanings, to have your voice heard in our democracy, to impact the direction of our nation, our state, your city, your own community, the way we make that voice heard is at the ballot box.
One thing I hear from folks is I hear people say, I'm not a strong Democrat or I'm not a strong Republican, and so therefore I'm not really engaged in the process. In California, those who are registering as what's called no party preference, that group is gaining momentum and gaining numbers at a greater rate than either of the political parties. And so if you don't feel strongly about a political party, it's still important to vote because there are really, really critical issues that affect all of us. And no matter where you live, you've got reason to come to vote.
And all we have to do is stop and think about what those things that we care about are. As I'm out and about speaking at high schools and colleges and naturalization ceremonies and other community events, I point out to people that historically we see the bumps in participation around presidential races and then drop-offs for state and municipal races when, depending on your concern, maybe it's access to health care. Well, who the county supervisor is in your area determines a lot of things like county clinic funding and county hospitals, for example. Maybe your passion is education. Well, your local school board race should be at the top of mind. Maybe college affordability. For a lot of high school students, it's how am I going to be able to afford college? Well, the governor and the legislature has a lot more to say about that than Congress does. So every election is important. That's number one. But number two, we talked earlier about automatic voter registration. Think about the beauty of this. If you're eligible to vote in America today but not registered, you don't get the voter information guide from the state. If you're eligible to vote in America today but not registered, your county does not send you the sample ballot. If you're eligible to register to vote in America today but not registered, chances are candidates and campaigns are not knocking on your door or calling you during dinner time. And nowadays, posting and tweeting at you or sending you email. So just the sheer systematic addition of millions of eligible but unregistered voters to the rolls creates that activity. It creates government informing you about what's on the ballot and when and where to go vote. It creates the activity of campaigns reaching out. And what other reports have shown is it creates that dialogue within a family or in the workplace or across neighbors in the community in general about the elections, and that tends to increase turnout.
You mentioned the naturalization ceremonies. I know you go up and down the state to speak to the new citizens here in California, and you see the fire in their eyes. That must charge your batteries, right? They're ready to vote that day. They'll walk to the ballot box as soon as they get their papers.
Oh, my gosh. If you have not witnessed a naturalization ceremony here, you have to. I mean, even if you don't know anybody who's going through the process, just to be in a room like that, a gathering of usually hundreds of people at a time, from all corners of the world, you stop and appreciate the step that they're taking, the commitment that they're taking, that regardless of where they're from, regardless of their culture and background, they want to become United States citizens, and they've gone through the process to earn citizenship. It's a step that's not taken lightly. It's a step that's so meaningful as a positive declaration. In the current political environment, when there's too many people at all levels of government scapegoating immigrants and trying to demean what immigrants represent in our country, it's so important. But for me, it's also personal. My parents are immigrants to this country. My parents came like millions have over generations. It is the story of our nation. They came here in pursuit of the American dream. to work hard, to contribute, and to raise a family and to try to have a better life. And so for me to see in the thousands upon thousands of newly sworn citizens the image of my parents and recognizing their hard work, their sacrifice, their struggle, their contributions and success, and their pride in each and every one of those new citizens, their stories to be told about what they and their families have contributed and will continue to contribute to this country.
Flashback for me, the first time you voted.
1976, I was a student at UCLA, and my mother called me, as I recall, and said, "Have you voted?" And when I said no, she got very angry with me, so I went and voted. So that's what I recall about that election.
1992. I turned 18 the year prior, so this was the first election I can vote on. I was a student at MIT, so I had to request my vote by mail ballot to be sent cross-country to vote in that presidential election in 1992. And this was, again, a couple of years before Proposition 187 that I mentioned, which finally is what triggered my parents to become citizens, not just for the sake of becoming citizens, but specifically so that they could register and that they could vote, and they never missed an election after that.
So just a couple other thoughts. You know, we do live in this incredible country, really incredible country, and the country calls on us to do relatively little as compared to other places. You know, we got to pay our taxes. We should vote. We should serve on juries. But the other thing that we should do, and we must do, is that every 10 years we've got a census. It's critically important as well in 2020 that everyone fill out the questionnaire. It's important because it means resources for California. Estimates are between $1,000 and $2,000 per person. So if someone, every man, woman, or child, who doesn't fill out the census form, or the head of household doesn't include them in their census form, that is a great loss for all of us. And there's going to be a very controversial question. My prediction is that there's a question going to be on the ballot concerning whether you're a citizen or not a citizen.
Well, that's the point. It's possible that this census, for the first time in generations, is going to be compromised. There are folks that are going to not participate because of the pressure in these questions.
And I know that folks are skeptical of government. You know, I have some skepticism of some parts of government. But the one thing that I am confident of is that when you fill out that questionnaire and you fill out the question as to whether you're a citizen or non-citizen, that will be kept confidential. You know, I think it's going to be on the questionnaire in order to harm California. I think that's its intent, that's its purpose, and it's our mission to make sure that it doesn't do much harm to California. But it is critical that everyone fill out the entire questionnaire, including that question. And we may hear fake news stories. I hate to use that term, but we may even hear fake news stories about folks that somehow that information is leaked. I don't think that'll be true, but I do think that there's going to be an effort to have what's called an undercount in California so that we don't get our fair share of resources.
Well, thanks to my friend Governor Newsom, we now have some additional responsibilities in the Secretary of State's office, including chairing the California Complete Count Committee. So it's a coalition not just of representatives across state government, but in partnership with local governments and the private sector to put the word out on two things. Number one, why the census is so darn important. As Tom mentioned, there's literally cumulatively billions of dollars in federal funding at stake for the next decade. California's fair share of healthcare dollars, transportation dollars, housing dollars, etc., all comes back to our census count, our population count. Census data also drives the reapportionment process. So literally how many representatives California gets in Congress will be determined by the census. A population undercount means we won't have the level of representation that we deserve. By extension, by the way, if you care about fair redistricting, that's all driven by census data as well. So a census undercount undermines redistricting and therefore voting rights. But the challenges are clear, not just the possibility of a question about citizenship. That'll be decided by the Supreme Court soon enough. This will also be an underfunded census. We won't see the level of enumerators, right, the canvassers that go out every census to follow up for people who haven't responded to the survey. And this will be a digital first census for the first time. Most of us are used to getting that form in the mail to fill out. This go around, most people will get a postcard first with instructions on how to go online to submit your information without sufficient appreciation, in my opinion, to a digital divide that still exists in America, including California. So whether it's access to the internet, digital literacy, we're going to have to be all hands on deck to make sure that everybody we know, every neighbor, every coworker, every friend, every family member participates in the census.
Cybersecurity in the elections. The legitimacy of an election is only as good as the reliability of the machines that are counting the votes. What is the Secretary of State's office? What's the legislature doing securing our election for 2020? Elaborate on that.
So a couple of things. First, for many, many years now, there's been some policies in place that have served California well in securing our elections. The voting systems that we use in each county to mark ballots, to collect ballots, to count ballots, etc., have to be tested and certified for use first. So they all have to meet our state security requirements or exceed them. Otherwise, they're not available for a county to use. We also test machines for logic and accuracy before every election. California requires paper ballots. Wish every state did, but in California, we require paper ballots in a voter-verified paper trail, and we require every county to conduct a post-election audit after every election to make sure that the numbers are accurate and we protect the integrity of our elections. But in 2016, we learned a lot. We learned a lot about how not just, but especially agents of the Russian government have tried to compromise some of these voting systems. And so we've done a lot of upgrades to our infrastructure, a lot of cybersecurity training at the state level and at the local level. But what's been a little bit tougher is, frankly, is to challenge a lot of the misinformation and disinformation that's out there. And so California is getting a little bit more proactive and sophisticated to try to promote official, trusted information about when, where, and how to vote, and the results of every election so that people have the confidence in the elections that they deserve.
I think every Californian can be confident of two things. One is that their vote will be secure. Two, that we're going to make sure that the votes are counted appropriately. And then back to the census, number three is that their census form will be confidential, and so that they need not be concerned about those two issues.
Final question, gentlemen. The big challenge here, the fallout regarding voter issues and access to security and efforts to have a fair and accurate census comes really down to the sense of power or agency that voters feel in their democratic process. It's a profound act of faith, voting and even counting yourself in a decennial survey. How do you as elected officials, but more importantly, as Californians, as Americans, use your bully pulpits, your power to convince your fellow Californians that this is an act of faith, and in order to reap benefits from this act of faith, voting and being part of a census, you have to act?
Look, I think fundamentally we all appreciate it as human beings. There's that old adage, it takes a village to raise a child. Look, it takes more than just a village to maintain the strength of our democracy. You know, we all have a role to play here, and I believe most people are driven by the interest of the greater good, not just, what does it mean for me? And whether it's participating in our democracy and respect for a more inclusive democracy. Most people get that and believe in that. And so it is for the census. Problem is the census only comes around once every 10 years, so it's not as ingrained culturally, but it's no less significant. So we'll be promoting those messages of not just why it's good for you, but why it's good for the state of California, and this is part of the strength of this democracy they will live in the United States of America.
So we're stewards. The Secretary and I are stewards of our democracy here in California and stewards of our democracy in the United States. We've been going for over 200 years, and ensuring that people have faith in their government, that they believe that their votes will be counted, people believe that institutions will survive or will flourish, it's our responsibility to demonstrate that. I do think that some of our institutions are being attacked right now, so that's why this election is perhaps more important than others that we've seen. And our collective responsibility as leaders here in California is to demonstrate why it is so important, especially in this next election cycle, to be heard.
We could spend so much more time on so many details of these issues, but I'm really grateful to both of you for your time on a busy day. Mr. Secretary, up and down the state you are. Senator, you have a busy agenda here at the Capitol. Thank you both for being on the program with me today. Really appreciate your time.
Thank you, Brian. Let's do it again.
We will. Right. That ends our conversation on this edition of Then There's California. We're a production of the California State Senate Democratic Caucus with technical assistance and great ideas and support from Martin Ashley, Bob Brulte, Brian Shadden, and Rainier Sabiniano, John Roman, George Soros, McLeana Woods, Ariana Medell, Lisa Murphy, and Aaron Kasheshian, and the graphic design talents of Tim Davis. On behalf of Senator Tom Umberg of Garden Grove in Orange County, the chair of our Senate Election Committee, and California Secretary of State Alex Padilla, I'm Brian Green here at the State Capitol in Sacramento. Thanks for listening to Then There's California.